Hello, these are flipped notes 5-3 as part of our cognition unit, and we're focusing on memory retrieval and forgetting. My Bitmoji's got a reminder stamp because this section is all about how we try to remember things from the memory storage. Retrieval is getting information out of the memory store. So we talked about encoding and then storage, and then now we're to the retrieval part. A couple different ways we can measure memory, and we usually do this through testing. How do we know if you remember something unless we test you over it or have a question about it? Recognition is one way to identify if somebody can remember something, and it's one of the easier ways. In recall, you have to retrieve information using effort. So that takes a bit more to get information out of the memory storage. When we store memories, though, they're not usually just in there all by themselves. They're in there as sort of a web of associations. So to try to retrieve one detail, you can retrieve other neighboring ones. So maybe your story reminds you of another story, and that's the way our retrieval cues work. Priming is also a way that we're able to get things out of our memory store. To retrieve a specific memory from your web of associations, you activate one strand, and then that triggers something else. Priming is also like giving a hint that it starts with a certain letter or it sounds like this. That's priming. It helps you to trigger that memory retrieval process. Sometimes the process is difficult because you have to try to figure out, did this really happen or was this a false memory? In reality monitoring, you're trying to decide whether memories are based on external or internal sources. Did this really happen or did I dream this? Did I tell you that or did I just think about telling you that? So when you're engaging in reality memory, you're trying to monitoring, you're trying to reflect on whether something actually happened or whether you only thought about it happening. So as if memory is not confusing enough, you're trying to remember, is this a real memory or just a random thought that I had? Source monitoring is when you're trying to figure out the origin of the memory. So let's say you hear a random fact about politics. Where did you hear that from? Was it from something you saw on CNN? Was it something you saw on an Instagram post? When you're trying to figure out where the information came from, then that is source monitoring. Destination memories involve recalling who you have told what. So, did I already tell you this? Did somebody else tell you this? So, they always say when it comes to telling the truth, you should always tell the truth, and then you don't have to try to remember which story you told who. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Deja vu is that weird phenomenon where you're just kind of going through life and all of a sudden you get this weird feeling like, oh, I feel like I've been here. We've had this, we've experienced this before. So we're not totally sure what causes deja vu, but some people think that one situation can unconsciously trigger the retrieval of a similar experience. Another theory is that it's actually just slow processing of your brain and you did experience it before, like milliseconds ago. And your brain's just kind of getting caught up. So you feel like you've been there before, and it's just because somehow your brain processing is a little bit lagging, kind of like a slow internet connection. Context effects can serve as retrieval cues. And one of these are state dependent memories. So the idea here is that we recall memories better when we're in the same place where we formed the memory. So it depends on the state we were in, and you can think of state as like a place. In this study, the scuba divers learned the words either under the water or they learned the words above the water. It was a list of like vocabulary words. And the ones who learned the words underwater and then were also quizzed underwater did better than if they learned the words underwater and then they were quizzed up on land. So they did better remembering the information where the memory was formed. In another study, these babies learned to kick a mobile in one crib with different patterns around them. And then when they were in a different crib, they didn't do it as well as if they were in the same context. Similar to state dependent memories are mood congruent and mood dependent memories. These are where we can recall other experiences and other memories when we were in the same mood. So our emotion serves as the retrieval cue. So, for example, when people are fighting, they're really mad. And then all of a sudden they remember all the other times that they were mad at that person and they start bringing up old stuff. That's that mood dependent memory retrieval, that they recall other times they were in the same mood. It could be good or it could be bad. That maybe when you're happy, you remember other times you were all happy. When you're sad, you remember other times that you were sad. But what about when you can't get information out of the memory store, when you're unable to retrieve something? That's when we have forgetting. So forgetting is technically just an inability to retrieve information, and there's different reasons. It could have been poorly encoded, it could be a storage issue, or a retrieval issue. So probably maybe one of the bigger reasons why we don't remember things is that we never encoded it to begin with. We never put it into our brain. That there was something else going on. There was just too much information coming at you at one time, or maybe you were distracted. Were you on your phone? Were you listening to someone else talk? Were you in la la land? Were you asleep? There's just so much information coming at you that a lot of it never even makes it into short-term or long-term memory. That's an encoding failure. Ebbinghaus, who we remember earlier from studying the nonsense syllables, says that we have poor durability of stored memories, and that leads to their decay. That just over time, memories decay, kind of like teeth, that our teeth start to decay. And he describes what's now called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And he said that retention drops a lot at the very beginning, that most information is lost right there within the first days of learning it. But then it levels off and we retain about 20% of what we initially learned. And that's over like a month. Now, this is without continued rehearsal. If you keep using that information, you'll retain more of it. But if you learn something and you don't do anything with it, a lot of that information goes away right away, but then it levels off. This was kind of confirmed in this other study where they looked at how much people remembered of a foreign language course years after taking it, and they recalled about 30% of what they had learned over 50 years. So I feel like that's right. I've taken a lot of Spanish, and that's probably about how much I can recall. Recognition tends to be better than recall over time. So if we're taking a test and it's over information you haven't had in a long time, multiple choice is going to be easier than if you had to do an essay or some kind of fill in the blank. So retention over time, recognition is easier than recall. Retrieval failures are another reason that we forget, that the information is in our memory store. It's in long-term memory. We just can't get it out. We have a retrieval failure. This could be called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's actually a thing. When you have the information, you just can't quite get it. Like, I know it starts with the letter P. What part of the brain helps regulate sleep? It's part starts with the P, and there was a puppy, and it was sleeping under a bridge. What was that? It was the pons. So tip of the tongue phenomenon, a lot of times priming or some other kind of retrieval cue will help you get it out of the memory store. Another reason why we forget things is because of interference. Sometimes learning some new information can interrupt or disrupt retrieval of other information. With proactive interference, actually I have these on the next slide. Oh, here it is. Never mind. With proactive interference, you can't remember the new stuff because the old information is interfering. And with retroactive interference, you can no longer remember the old stuff because the new stuff is interfering. So proactive interference, I remember this by saying proactive, you can't remember the new. I just repeat that over and over. So this would be like if you call your new girlfriend your old girlfriend's name, you can't remember the new girlfriend's name. So the old information is still so strong in your memory that you can't remember the new information. That's proactive interference. With retroactive interference, you can't remember the old information. Retroactive interference can't remember the old. So maybe you got a new locker. Now you remember your new locker combination, but you can't remember the old one. The old memory is affected. An acronym that lots of psych people, I didn't come up with this one, some psych teachers came up with, is PORN. Using proactive old affects the recall of new, and retroactive new affects the recall of old. So proactive old, retroactive new. I don't use that one to remember for myself, but that one might help you remember a little bit better. So again, with retroactive, the old can't be remembered. New learning interferes with the old. Proactive interference, old learning interferes with the new. How do you stop this? You're learning new information all the time. Turns out sleep prevents retroactive interference and it leads to better recall. So when you're getting plenty of sleep, you tend not to forget the old stuff. So it shows here after sleep without interfering events, recall is better. But if you try to stay awake for too long, then you're not going to remember the old stuff as well. It's our boy Sigmund Freud. He has some theories about why we forget as well. He said that people don't realize it, that it's unconscious that they revise their memories, that maybe their unconscious mind could not cope with a memory, so they just revise the memory. The other thing he says about memory has to do with repression, which is a defense mechanism where when something is so traumatic or hard to cope with, your mind just banishes it and you just don't even think about it. You didn't even forget it. It just says it no longer exists to you. That has been a repressed memory. So why do we forget? A little bit of a summary here. The sensory memory, the senses momentarily register amazing detail, but they leave a lot of stuff out. Short-term memory, a few items are noticed and encoded, but not everything. In long-term storage, some items are altered or lost. And then depending on interference, retrieval cues, moods, motives, some things get retrieved, but not everything. So even though we have that infinite long-term memory, you got to be able to get it out of that memory store and able to use it. So what happens when we're trying to recall a memory, but we have gaps? Our brain wants to automatically fill in the gaps, fill in the missing pieces. But sometimes we fill it in with incorrect information, and that's called the misinformation effect, when we incorporate misleading information into our memory of an event. And a lot of times we do it unconsciously. We don't even realize we're doing it. The major researcher who studied this was Elizabeth Loftus, and we are going to talk about her some more in class. She's still alive and around. But her famous study that she did involved showing different groups of people pictures of an accident. And this is a picture of the actual accident here, showing how much the cars had been damaged, how much glass there was. And eyewitnesses had to reconstruct their memories when they were questioned about the event. Now, one group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? And the other group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? So a week later, they asked them, was there any broken glass? And group B, who was asked, how fast were they going when they were smashed into each other, reported more broken glass. So hearing that phrase, smashed into, changed their recall of the scene versus the group that heard hit. So it was just a very simple difference, but the way they worded it altered the way they remembered it. We'll talk more about Loftus. Source amnesia is when we can't remember where the information came from. We talked about source monitoring, trying to monitor where the information came from. Well, when you can't remember, it's source amnesia. We sometimes also call this misattribution, that we attribute or we blame the information for coming from a different source. So this kind of ties into children's eyewitness recall. Can children be trusted in their memories? Children's recall can be unreliable if the leading questions are posed. So it really depends how you ask the question. But when they have people who work with groups like CPS, who are questioning children about abuse or trauma, they've been trained to ask them these questions very neutrally. So hopefully it won't alter memories. In cases of sexual abuse, this usually suggests a lower percentage of abuse. We'll get to more of that. But what about memories of abuse that have been repressed or constructed? Many psychotherapists believe that early childhood sexual abuse does result in repressed memories. So a lot of Freudian ideas we discredit, but the idea of a repressed memory is something that is pretty widely accepted. The idea that you could have memories that are so traumatic that they're kind of banished from your mind, that you don't think about them. But not everybody agrees. Other psychologists question such beliefs and think that such memories may be constructed. that maybe they recreated these memories, that they created them maybe from false or misleading information. Loftus did some research where she showed that if you incorporate false information, it'll affect how people recall it. She actually did some examples where she had told people that their mom said that they had been lost at the mall when they were a little kid. And then later she talked to them and asked them, were you ever lost at the mall? And they fabricated these stories that they remembered being lost at the mall, but it had never happened. They were constructed memories. And she showed how easy it is to feed people information that they basically absorb it and it becomes part of their memories. So then what does that say about kids who've been abused? Is it a real memory or a false memory? Leading psychological associations of the world do agree on these things about childhood sexual abuse. They agree that unfortunately injustice happens, that incest and other sexual abuse happen, and it is very possible that people may forget, and it's possible that recovered memories happen. That's very common. Recovered memories, though, if they happen under hypnosis or any kind of drugs, are unreliable. And any memories from before the ages of 3 are also unreliable. And that's just because of the way the brain processes memories at that age. And memories, whether they're real or false, can still be emotionally upsetting. And then we have two sides here with the controversy of recovered memories. Supporters of repressed memory theory, abuse is more common. They say that abuse is more common than we think, and that repression is the natural response to trauma, that trying to study this in a lab situation compared to emotional events is not the same, and that there's no direct and empirical evidence about repressed memories. Whereas the people who are skeptical of repressed memory theory, they don't think people are lying on purpose, but they do think that therapists may be asking them leading questions, and that causes the formation of a false memory. Countless studies show how easy it is to create false memories. Some court cases even discredit the existence of repressed memories. And then the misinformation effect, source monitoring, and other research areas show us that memory is not as reliable as many of us think. So it is definitely unreliable. Lots of ways memory can go wrong. By the way, did you figure out who those first two people were? Brad Pitt, Oprah Winfrey. That's it for Flipped Notes 5-3.